I really wish I could fit into this neat little bubble that you have created. I was going to church with the family. They had no reason to think I wasn't a believer. And I actually, felt like a wolf in sheep's clothing at that point. I'm like, wow, I really feel like I'm the only one here who doesn't believe this. I don't want to be passing the plate around and lighting the Christ candle when it really has no meaning to me and it's fooling other people. So I decided to be honest about my lack of belief.
I didn't want anything higher than me. And at that time, one thing I noticed or felt was that people who believed in Christianity were weak, or they needed a crutch. And then, from my perspective, provisionally, God put a couple of men in my life who were like SWAT team leaders, that kind of quality of people who were strong believers. And that among other things just kind of turned and started removing roadblocks, mental roadblocks, emotional roadblocks.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of irRational. My name is Kurt Parks. I host these conversations every month where we bring people from opposing irrational views together to talk about where we can find the rational middle ground, to find out, is there actually more that unites us than what actually divides us? And so we invite you every month to join the dialogue, not the divide. Well, today we've got a great show lined up for you. It is sponsored by New Bean Nation, which is a coffee subscription service that you can get a monthly box of coffee, or you can just order from their store. If you use the code irRational, you'll get 15% off your first order or your first monthly subscription box. And so if you want to check that out, head over to www.newbeannation.ca and take part in the freshest, fastest home-delivered coffee in the nation. All right. So we're going to start off. We've got Steve Giacottis with us. Steve is a humanist officiant who conducts secular marriages, memorials, and many more meaningful life-affirming celebrations. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in History and a Bachelor of Education in primary, junior, and intermediate grades. He was raised as a free thinker. Steve has been married to a Christian for over a decade. He and his wife, Cindy, believe in the importance of bridging the gap between believers and non-believers. Their two young children are being raised in an interfaith household and are free to choose their own path. His family dynamic inspired him to write Humanism from the Heart, Building Bridges Beyond Belief, a book that emphasizes the importance of working together to celebrate the diversity of worldviews. Steve serves as an ambassador for Humanist Canada, Recovering from Religion, and Sunday Assembly. In 2024, he was awarded the King Charles III Coronation Medal for significant contributions to his community in the Windsor, Essex, Ontario area. Steve, welcome to irRational. Good to have you with us.
Thanks so much.
We've also got Mike Hiscock. Mike is a retired pilot. He decided to fly in and join us today. He's a speaker and apologist for Apologetics Canada. Mike is a former Royal Canadian Air Force pilot, holds a Bachelor of Science from the Royal Military College of Canada, and holds a master's degree in Christian apologetics from Columbia Evangelical Seminary. Mike is currently residing in Halifax, Nova Scotia, trying to be retired with his wife Shirley, but spends a lot of time on their boat sailing and living the boat life. Mike, welcome to irRational. Good to have you with us as well. Steve and I would love to get some time on that boat. Just saying.
Hey,
Yeah.
Come on down, as they say.
Next episode, we're recording on the boat for sure.
Be careful what you say, Mike, is what they say. No, let's dig right in here, guys. I want to get the conversation going. Let's start with something nice and light, right? I like to say I'm doing that. This is for both of you. Steve, I'll start with you as far as answering this, and then we'll kind of go with the conversation from there. Do faith and reason approach truth in fundamentally different ways, or are they seeking the same thing using different tools or mechanisms of thought?
That's a really good question. And it's something that I put a lot of thought into on a daily basis because my wife is a person of faith, like you mentioned in the intro. So, I do also find that there are ways to find that faith can be a rational position. And, for a long time, I kind of went through an angry atheist phase where I kind of lashed out at people for their lack of belief for their beliefs. And it just, I had to overcome that part of my life and find a way to reconcile where I find that people who believe in things that are higher than themselves hold significant meaning for that person. So I find that, faith is a reasonable position to hold. Whereas I also find that, having lack of faith is also a reasonable position to hold. Personally, I believe that because, so far along my journey, I haven't come across any evidence that I find to be sufficient for me to believe in something outside of the natural world as we see it today.
Cool. Mike, can I get your take on that? Just kind of that idea of different tools or mechanisms of thought? Go ahead.
Absolutely. But before that, if you don't mind, I'd like to just take a step back to the intros a little bit, because something probably you may not have known is that I actually had a marital story much like Steve's.
I did know that, actually.
Wow.
My wife, I told my wife I was a non-believer back in the day, a week before our wedding during a pre-marriage counseling session. So that was a wee bit of a surprise for her.
Wow. Yeah.
And we went through that for about well over about a decade. So, and then, how I came to faith, I was actually on a boys' trip, and I thought, oh, I better buy her something, to get my kitchen pass renewed. And I went into a bookstore, and a big bookstore on the main drag in Nashville, and bought a book. To this day, I don't know where it was, how I came across it, but I put it in my backpack, and on the way home, I was, a pastor was come some buddies, and I was bored. So I picked out this book, and it was Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel.
Neat. Yeah.
And that led me down, a path of investigation. And luckily, the church that Shirley was attending, the pastor there, Kerry Newhoff, had been a practicing lawyer before he went to seminary. So he understood the importance of evidence. So, and that's, from my perspective, how I basically came to faith. So that's why I probably have a bit of a different take on that definition compared to Steve and his straight epistemological background. So I would put something like the definition of faith of something like trusting in something that you have reason to believe is true. I think there's a portion of evidence that goes along with that definition. And I think if you look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, their definition would be a little bit like that. And I equate it to something like going to fly on an airliner. Someone wouldn't know if the airplane's been maintained, if the pilots are trained. You have an implicit trust, a faith in the system. So, but then at the same time, I would, I think there's another aspect, and that's been put forward by philosopher Alan Plantinga, and an idea of a properly basic theistic belief, where there's a warrant given for Christians by the Holy Spirit to say that there is truth in God. And so at the end of the day, I think they work together.
Yeah, so that's interesting, and I did know that story because I had watched the video you recorded, or someone had recorded. I think it was at a Baptist church, like about 6 years ago or so. You had talked about speaking to skeptics and things like that. So I heard a bit of your background, and I was going to ask you about that because I think that's super interesting. Because I'm about to turn 40, so you were pretty much up until my age a non-believer. So that's a really interesting thing. The way that I'm kind of seeing faith is I'm kind of seeing it from the way that Soren Kierkegaard has presented it. That like there shouldn't have to be external evidence to base your beliefs on if you stick with faith, because faith, as the Bible describes, is the evidence of what is it, the unknown, evidence of what you can't see, right? So just I think that so just coming from my perspective, when I'm taking a look at the rationality of faith, I think coming from Soren Kierkegaard's perspective, where it's like you put your trust and your faith into something that you don't know to be true, but that you really hope is true. I think that there is a rationality to that. So it's really cool. I want to get into that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that, William Lane Craig, he kind of makes a difference between knowing and showing. So, he would say that, Plantinga's idea of what he calls a sensus divinitatis would be internal, and that could be, adequate for somebody. But it's different if I want to show someone or talk to someone about my faith.
Right.
Then, what's internal to me is, practically of little value. Then we have to have some kind of mutual language of communication.
Yeah, and I think also kind of that's where I would depart from that, because I do believe that, for me personally, I actually kind of appreciate when someone has a strong faith in the beliefs that they have, but then they're not really trying to push it on to somebody else. And it's not a big deal. I know it happens a lot, and people are joyous about what they believe, and they want to share that with everybody, and they want everyone to be kind of in the same boat as them. And I can appreciate that, because the same thing, I want that for other people as well. But I don't want people to come to my system of belief unless they're actually convinced of it. And I don't go out of my way to try and force that on anyone. So just that's kind of where I take it, is that I think it's a bit more important when it makes meaning and purpose for that individual person, and that they're not necessarily trying to convert other people.
Yeah, I guess I could think of some analogies. I mean, if someone, had the cure for cancer, I'm sure somebody with cancer would want to know about the cure.
For sure.
And
That's a different type of
so
thing though, right? That's yeah, I would say so. Yeah, for sure.
how?
Well, I mean, if it's something that's going to lead to, an advancement in extending your life, something that we can see here with evidence backing, right? To be able to see that it's going to extend your life because this person has a disease that now needs to be cured.
Yeah, and I think you could see that there's a bunch of, like, we could tell there's a bunch of different kind of pieces to this puzzle, and
There
where
definitely is.
evidence
Yeah.
fits in,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and the like. So,
Right.
I mean,
No, I
yeah,
understand. I understand where you're coming from, and I appreciate where you're coming from. I just I just see it a little bit differently, and that's okay. And I think that's what this podcast is kind of about, is our
absolutely.
differences, but also what we can work together to achieve.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of layers to the questions of and I think we're going to uncover some of those throughout this conversation, which is great. Steve, let's move here. From a humanist perspective, is everything meaningful ultimately explainable through reason, science, and evidence?
It's another really good question, and you know what? You're going to keep hitting me with good questions, and I'm going to, try and do my best here. You're going to hear me say this a lot, and this is just something I say in my everyday life, and it's something I encourage everybody to say, is that I don't know, right? I don't know can be the most honest answer that you can give. So in this situation, I can say I don't know for sure. I do feel that reason and evidence are good ways to come to truth, if you can consider truth being something that comports to reality. But I also find immense, immense meaning in someone finding their own meaning and finding that their feelings and emotions are connected to what it is that they're attached to. Like I find my meaning and purpose in my family. So just having that as being, something that's important to me, I didn't get there by reason and evidence. I got there by feeling this is someone who I feel close to. When I met my wife, I'm like, what, this person is amazing. I feel like I'm going to go over and smash ice cream cake in her face, because that's how we met. I actually smashed a piece of ice cream cake across her face, and then I just kind of got embarrassed, and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." I started eating it off of her face. And then she's like, "What is going on?" So I ended up walking up the stairs, and I turned around. She's right behind me, right? And it was an emotional connection that we had. So I didn't reason my way into doing that. I thought that's probably the most irrational thing I could have done, is smash a piece of ice cream cake in someone's face, thinking it was going to lead to a relationship. So, I do feel like there is room for emotion. There's room for love and things like that as well.
Hmm. Mike, do you believe that human reason has limits? And if so, is faith a bridge over those limits, or is it a form of knowledge right into its own right?
Well, I think we talked about that a little bit prior. I think they can be separate. They can work together in terms of much of what can be discovered by reason. Again, from my perspective, the reason that I came to faith in Jesus is because of reason and evidence. I mean, that's my whole background. It was science background, and that's kind of my whole work has been technical in my entire career. So that is the way that I think, to the depth of my core. So to me, reason, absolutely. I came to faith in the Christian worldview because of reason. Now, at the same time, I think that this idea of faith, again, as I talked about earlier, I think there's two things that come together in that definition. So if by faith you mean a blind faith, or in this faith in the sense that Plantinga, kind of holds, then I would say again, yeah, they're both good. They're both valid ways of knowing things. As for Steve, we'll probably get into this a little bit later, but Steve puts an emphasis on feelings for. It seems like feelings for determining truth. I don't know if I'm putting words in his mouth or not, but we'll kind of talk about that.
I was just saying I was leaving some open.
Okay.
Yes, I'm leaving some openings for emotions also guiding us towards certain things.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that'll be a little bit different, but yes. So that's kind of where I stand. I think they work together, and there's room for both certainly within the Christian worldview.
So, Mike, being an atheist yourself or secular humanist, I'm not sure what term you would have used for yourself back then.
Atheist for sure.
Okay, okay. He's just like, we're not pulling punches. Just going back to those days, what was the biggest hurdle you had to overcome to change your complete worldview?
Question. That's 30 years ago. I don't even think I can remember what I had for lunch yesterday. So I would say just, the fact that did God exist? That was probably the biggest hurdle. Can I believe that there, is a God, period, who's the creator of heaven and earth? That was, once kind of in that particular book, it kind of started and it asked some really good questions. So then, eventually through the, looking at more and more evidence and looking at the arguments, I came to believe that it would have taken more faith to remain an atheist than become a Christian. But, but it was basically the basis of that whole event was really the question of, does God exist?
Steve, let me throw that question at you. What would you say would be the biggest holdup or hang up that you've got about looking at Christianity? Because you really have a front row seat to it. Your wife is a Christian. What's the biggest thing that holds you up?
Well, I think just having a background in kind of an outsider looking in, kind of like Mike had, but at the same time, I went through a lot of different phases throughout my life where I believed different things and I thought different things. And I kind of worked my way through all of those, including conspiratorial thinking. So just things like that, where I'd actually train my mind in a way that is like critical thinking, right? So just approaching things with a critical mind and just saying like, is there any truth to this? And actually, doing my best to research what I think, may be may have some evidence or somehow have some truth to it. But there's so many different, not just religions out there, but also denominations of things like Christianity, Islam. There's so many different positions where you could investigate for years and years and either be convinced of it or not. And I just find that I don't have sufficient evidence to be convinced of these positions. Now, if something was presented to me that like Mike had an experience where he read a book and then all of a sudden now, a light clicks and cool, that could happen to me. I haven't had that happen to me in my life, and I feel that humanism, like the principles of humanism, living by those is enough for me. But I can see why other people definitely would gravitate towards feeling like they need something higher than themselves.
That's interesting because if it was almost kind of the opposite, that's one thing I noticed was that, yeah, I guess I didn't want anything higher than me. And at that time, one thing I noticed or felt was that people who believed in Christianity were weak, or they needed a crutch. And then, from my perspective, provisionally, God put a couple of men in my life who were like SWAT team leaders, that kind of quality of people. And who were strong believers. And that among other things just kind of turned and started removing roadblocks, mental roadblocks, emotional roadblocks.
It's interesting to know like what it is then that actually, I'm just trying to think, because for myself, I never felt that way. I always felt that, like, even when I went through an angry atheist phase, I always thought, these people are super kind. These people don't deserve me treating them the way that I was treating them, right? And a lot of times I'm like, these people are the most intelligent people I know are Christians, right? So there's got to be some type of lack of communication or something during when you're going through a crisis like that, where you're putting someone in a different box or something like that. But yeah, I never felt like these people were weak or anything like that. I always had appreciation for people of all different walks. And I think, growing up in a position where I was surrounded by people who were, Muslim and Christian and Hindu, and I heard all of the stories my whole life. And I just thought, what, it's really cool that these people have a meaningful part of their life that they can be attached to, and they actually have other people that are in that same community. And I just never felt like I fit into any of those communities. And when it came to the secular humanist community, I'm like, oh, okay, this actually resonates with me. So maybe it's just a thing where you have to find your people who resonate with you the most.
Interesting. Reading your book, my thought often was, man, Steve's a much better person than I am.
Oh, no. I don't want you to think, I should rewrite it then. I'm sorry. I'll do an updated edition. I'll do the Mike Hiscock edition here.
There you go.
It'll be one page and it wouldn't be pretty, trust me. So
It's a great book. I encourage people to go read it. Actually, you can get it on Amazon. I'll post a link in the show notes after. But some of the stories are absolutely like, I can't believe one. Steve, I need to apologize. You had to go through all these crazy stories to
You know what,
get
though?
to
It
your
made my
wife
life
today.
interesting. So, it
Yeah.
just, yeah, it was a fun time. And like I said, I never really judge anyone for the way that they are. I feel that like people deserve grace no matter what, right? I mean, obviously, if you're causing harm, there's a difference there. But the majority of people who are just trying to get through life and try to get along with other people and create a better environment for everyone. Everyone deserves grace in that sense.
Grace, that's a very faith oriented word. It's interesting to hear you use it a couple of times
Well,
there.
it's funny too because people will always give me a hard time because I always say, "Well, prayer works." And they're like, "What do you mean prayer works?" Like, you're an atheist. I said, "Well, yeah, it calms your body down. It brings your blood pressure down. It helps you breathe, helps you, think internally about what it is that you want to accomplish. So many things, so many benefits to prayer, So I have no qualms with saying words that are maybe a little bit more on the religious side.
So, Steve, in your role as an officiant, is that something that comes into that role? Is leading people in, like, would you call them meditations, forms? How would you approach that?
No, so this is the difference, and a lot of people get confused because they think officiant means chaplain, and I'm not a chaplain. Yeah, so officiant is more like somebody who's just has a license to be able to marry people, but I kind of do take it a little bit more seriously because I'm part of an organization called Recovering from Religion, which sounds more harsh than it is. It's actually an organization that was developed after somebody wrote a book. Dr. Darrell Ray wrote a book, and he had a group of people who wanted to meet and discuss, like, okay, I'm having problems with my wife who is a believer. I'm having problems with my kids who, they're ridiculing my beliefs and stuff. So he brought them together in this group. And he just let people vent. And they met at an IHOP, and they ended up closing down the IHOP because the manager kicked them out at like 2 a.m. or something. Like, all right, you guys got to get out of here. But he found a real need for this. And what it is, it's an organization who does not aim to deconvert anyone. It's there to meet people where they're at. So you meet people, if they're on their journey out of a faith or their journey into a faith, or if, they're saying my church is very anti-LGBT, we're going to find you a church that's different, that doesn't discriminate, that type of thing. So there's a lot of different nuance to it. And I think that background of me being able to talk to these people and guiding people and offering resources has enabled me to kind of take on that as I'm also meeting with people to do their weddings and funerals and things like that. And I do have people who approach me and say, you know what, like, I don't want this wedding to be a very religious wedding, but I do want to mention the word God, or I do want to have a Bible verse read. And I have no problems doing that. I can mention God. I can say, Allah. It doesn't matter to me, because to me, these are just words. To them, it's more important and it's meaningful to them. So I have no problem doing that. And I feel that there is a distinction between officiant and chaplain. I am definitely not a chaplain, which I hope to one day be a chaplain. I need a master's degree, but then I'm hoping to become a humanist chaplain one day.
Interesting. Okay. Mike, just as we move along here, what historical or philosophical reasons lead you to believe Jesus is who Christianity claims he is?
Well, that's
That's
how
a
much time do
doozy.
we have?
You're welcome.
Come on, Mike, convince the world here.
Well, I mean, so when we talk about Jesus and Christianity, I mean, the central part of Christianity is resurrection. Without it, Paul says, our work is in vain, basically. So I think to talk about that, what we really, it's a two-pronged thing. And the first one is pretty well a discussion about some sense of biblical reliability, and then probably a discussion for aspects of the resurrection itself. So if we're willing to go down, kind of that discussion route, then I'd love to.
Go for it.
Okay, so from my perspective, historical Christianity is about a person. It's about Jesus of Nazareth. I'm already getting dry here, and the movement he started. And then Jesus was an itinerant, wandering Jewish teacher who claimed to be the Messiah and the Jewish Son of Man. And then what we have generally within the Christian context of our scriptures is we have 29 books in the New Testament, but basically we have 4 ancient biographies of eyewitness testimony. The earliest dates between, say, 55, and then the last was written between 70 and 90, depending on which scholar we talk to. But we also have information that's outside of Scripture, extra biblical information. One of that I've just come across recently, and it's a 2025 book by T.T. Schmidt about the Jewish historian Josephus, and basically it was about his sources. And there I find, from my perspective, they're incredible. So Josephus wrote Antiquity of the Jews. He actually wrote about 500,000 words, and his book Antiquity of the Jews was written in about 93, 94. But his father was an eminent priest, and Josephus himself was raised in Jerusalem. So Josephus was born in 37, so his father was a priest at the time. And because it was Passover, I mean, almost all the Jews and certainly all the Levites, the priests would have returned to Jerusalem. So it's quite possible or even probable that Josephus' father was in Jerusalem for the weekend of the crucifixion. But even more so, at about AD 60, he was actually a general serving in the Jewish army under Ananias II. Well, Ananias II was the high priest that was responsible for putting James, the brother of Jesus, to death by stoning during a turnover in the Roman governorship, shall we say. And then, but it gets even more. And Ananias II was the son of Ananias I, who, when we're reading Mark's gospel, that was where Jesus was brought on the night of his trial. We don't know how old Ananias II was, but it's possible that he would have been alive and there that night. So, I mean, there's some incredible sources there from Josephus, and especially because, I mean, Ananias II, commanding officer, they exchanged over 60 letters. I mean, there would have been, I would assume, ample opportunity to talk about it. So then when we hear what Josephus wrote, now there's questions about what he wrote, but there's certainly a historical core that most scholars would agree to. So we have some pretty incredible evidence for the basis of the Christian story. So, and where am I going here?
That's super interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Mike.
Yeah, so basically it's the historical or philosophical reasons that lead you to believe Jesus is who Christianity claims he is.
Yeah, so we're starting there. So that's some of them. And then, we have other things that we could talk about if we want to get into it. We can talk about, external criticism, i.e. what other things we have about the New Testament, how old the manuscripts are. We have some things about internal coherence that are, really interesting in terms of archaeology. And then again, something maybe some of your listeners haven't heard about before. There's something called onomastic congruence. And basically it's a fancy name for how they use the names. Like if I were to ask someone, either one of you, to write a story and base it in, well, heck, even say 18th century Ottawa, and to get the names correct, not just the names in use, but their percentages and their profiles, it would be very difficult to do. I mean, I even think of my own life. My father's name is Ralph. He is the only Ralph that I know, because names change all the time. So what we see in the Gospels is that the authors of the Gospels get the percentages very close compared to what Judaism was in the first temple period. But as well is the really often used names, the popular ones, often or almost always had a kind of a second descriptor, like we have first and last names. So there they would have like Simon Peter. And so that differentiated, among all the Peters or the Simons, because there were so many. But a name like Philip, there weren't many. So you see in the Gospels how you just see Philip alone. So it's just kind of a detail that just kind of, again, encourages us or encourages me, but, just demonstrates some validity to the Gospels. And then, of course, we have textual criticism when we're looking at the manuscripts and how we do that. I'll stop there and see if there are any discussion points or things we want to talk about.
Sure.
I picture you in a room with all those like the pictures up all over the wall, and you got all the strings attached to everything. I just think that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's why I picture when people are talking about all the different links and stuff. I'm like, oh, that's a cool link, and putting up the big.
Yeah, exactly. It's like one of those big investigative boards, those glass boards that you see, on the FBI shows. Exactly. There's definitely a lot of strings to attach, for sure. Steve, when you evaluate the historical claims about Jesus, some of these textual writings and so on, from a humanist viewpoint, do you consider him, Jesus, as a historical figure? Was he some form of mythology, that type of a character, or something else? What do you do with the person of Jesus and the claims made about him and the evidences that are for him? Because surely you've encountered some of those.
Yeah, so that's also a really good question, and it's so nuanced because there are so many different opinions about who this person was. Was he the son of God? Was he an itinerant rabbi who just was preaching a message of difference in a time where people were in the time that he was? For me, I'm not a mythicist. I don't think that it was completely strictly a myth. I think that there was a person or many people, but most likely one person who a lot of these stories are attributed to. I do think that he had a good message to bring. I do feel like that, flipping over the tables of the money changers is a good thing, in certain circumstances, and we may be in one of those circumstances right now globally. But, I do think that a lot of stories were attributed to him that may not be completely based in reality. But again, I don't want to poke too hard because I do feel like that Jesus is a very meaningful person for a lot of people and a symbol. So I do feel like for myself, I could consider him to be a real person.
So just for people who are perhaps watching this or listening to this, who are curious about like an example that you might give for a story that has been attributed to Jesus or credited to Jesus that you feel can't be backed up, or that perhaps has been embellished a little bit, perhaps, or I'm not sure how you would describe that, but do you have an example of that?
I mean, I can go with small examples. I can go with a bigger example, but I really don't want to offend anyone. So like, I mean, if
Go offend away.
you won't offend anybody.
okay.
No.
I always want to make
please.
sure that I'm not going to push too many buttons or anything. But just the resurrection account, I don't think is based in reality. I mean, it's probably more likely that he was buried in a mass grave. Again, I really don't want to offend anyone. I really don't want to do that. But it's more likely based on historicity and the things that happened at that time that he was pushed into a mass grave upon death, and there's just been no accounts other than biblical accounts of people rising from the dead. So to me, I just don't find that that's based in reality, and I can appreciate for people who do and find meaning in it.
Mike, how would you answer this? Like as far as addressing this idea, because like everything, like you mentioned it earlier, everything in Christianity hinges on the resurrection of Jesus. And I've heard people say literally, if somebody were to turn up Jesus's body, or we found out that whatever, that they would completely walk away from their faith because it no longer has anything to stand on. It hinges that much on this issue of, did Jesus Christ rise from the dead, the grave, not from a hospital bed, not from a gurney that, and so what makes the resurrection compelling as a rational, reasonable argument, and what on this hinging issue do you feel best supports the claims that Jesus is alive?
Well, when we talk about the resurrection, there's, and I'm going to come to the mass grave idea, but the thing is, there are some facts. I'll use Gary Habermas's what he calls a minimum facts approach. I mean, there are certain aspects of what we know from Jesus's life that are agreed by most, whether they're skeptical or non-skeptical scholars, and they're typically very well evidenced in the Gospels. Which, I mean, we talk about. That's one thing we just have to be careful, and I want to separate out a little bit. Is we often talk about the Bible or the Gospels, but we have to remember they're actually, in terms of the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John, they're 4 individual letters, 4 individual evidence chains, 4 individual, there's some overlap in the sources, but in general, 4 different sources for information about Jesus. So, we can't say just the Bible says sometimes, or we have to kind of drill down and pay attention to the history and see it as 4 different sources. We know that, or I hope, well, I'll just say that I'll put forward the fact that when Jesus died in about 33 AD, and even Barterman says the crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans is one of the most secure facts we have about his life. And I have other quotes if we're interested in going down that road. But and that's why when you mentioned he walked off a gurney, that would be.
Well, it's interesting because the Ahmadiyya Muslims, like I've done a lot of interfaith symposiums, and their idea of Jesus is that he did survive.
Yeah, absolutely.
the crucifixion and then ended up rising from what would be considered dead because he looked and appeared dead at the time. So I think that's where Kurt's coming from on that, is there's different accounts
Absolutely.
and things. So, yeah.
And I think, well, we'll talk about it a little bit on our way. We'd have to consider what, in response to what that sect of, well, actually, I think it's pretty well in the Quran about that as well. But, that Muslims would believe that. But however, we have to keep in mind that what would it take for for the apostles to see, their Messiah hanging up on a cross, and after getting, basically whipped by the Romans and hung on a cross for a day and being able to barely survive. And then, to the point where they would see him as a risen Lord. I mean, he would be, even with all our medication today, he would be in incredibly bad shape. But in the context of First Temple Judaism, I mean, just as the infections alone would have probably killed him. But so for someone to say that he was nailed to a cross after being scourged and then somehow kind of, just got off the gurney and walked around and people declared him to be their Lord, because that's what we see in the earliest in 1 Corinthians 15. We have early hymns that use the word kurios, which is used 6,000 times, I believe, in the Septuagint to describe Yahweh or Father God kind of idea. So here we have Paul using this in 1 Corinthians 15 to describe Jesus. And even Ehrman says it's within a year. James Dunn, another skeptical New Testament scholar, says it's within months of the resurrection. So we had this incredibly early, idea of who Jesus was. And if he had been, basically scraped off a gurney and brought back, somehow, healed and taken care of back into life, I'd be very surprised if they saw him as, Yahweh or God or the Messiah.
I grew up in a faith family, and I've attended a lot of different, events about apologetics and stuff. And I can remember one guy said, he was talking with the crucifixion. And he said, the Romans were very, very good at what they did. They were efficient and professional killers. And I thought that was I don't know why that stuck with me all these years, but just that the Romans are good at what they do.
Absolutely.
And Mike, I know you wanted to address the mass grave thing, and we can come back to that in here a little bit if you want. But Steve, I want to get you in here on this. How do you interpret resurrection accounts from a secular framework? You sort of touched on this a little bit ago, but what criteria would you use then to assess supernatural claims? Or do you just believe that there are no such thing as supernatural anythings?
Hit me with the good questions again. So first of all, the way that I was just speaking on this all right now, we're talking about it kind of like from an internal critique, talking about it as me stepping inside the mind of a Christian, right? Whereas like for me, I'm on the outside of this. So I see different stories and different accounts, and even through different stories through history where there's been resurrections. So like ancient Egypt has a lot of resurrection accounts and other things like that. So for me, looking at all of these, and again, I don't want to come across as being downplaying anybody's religion or beliefs, but like to me, it seems like there's a mythological element to the stories, even if there was some basis for it in reality. So, the Jesus story, sure, there's probably a person named Jesus, but I don't think that the supernatural elements of the story are actually based in reality. Just the same as I would think that, like, the story of Horus, the Egyptian god, I don't think resurrected from the dead, even though there are stories that are accounting for that. For myself, I don't see any evidence of a supernatural world. It's not to say that it's not there, because again, I'm going to say I don't know. But to me, if there was evidence of a supernatural world or the supernatural, that would just mean that it fits somehow inside the natural world, because the natural world is all that we can investigate at this time. I don't think that there's any way to investigate anything supernatural. And I could be wrong. So I hope that answers that question.
Mike, I don't know if you wanted to come back on that or.
Yeah, I guess it probably comes down to, philosophical assumptions, because if you're a naturalist, and by definition, it's almost you're saying that miracles cannot happen.
I don't think that miracles can't happen. I just don't know what a miracle. Do you want to define what miracle is, maybe? Just so
I would say, some process that interrupts the natural laws or something of the sort.
Okay. So I mean I think that the problem that we have is that we just don't know beyond what the natural laws could be or how they, because there's lots of people that have done investigations and scientists and things, and there's even like Christian scientists who will do investigation to say there are quantum fields outside of what they believe is the confines of the universe that we see today, right? So it's just like there's so much to unpack and so much to understand that I don't see how it could be possible, but you know what? I'm not saying it's not possible.
Let's move a little more into personal experience and kind of get into your personal space a little bit, guys. I'd like for both of you to address this question, if you don't mind. Can personal, spiritual, or existential experiences be considered as valid evidence? Mike, why don't you start off on this one?
Again, going back to the position of Alvin Plantinga, I would say absolutely yes. I mean, and interestingly, when we look at what's happening right now in Iran, Iran is currently considered has one of the fastest growing groups of Christians on the planet, which is what you would think is kind of surprising. But what's doubly surprising is that within a lot of the Muslims coming to faith, north of 20% believe or have come to faith through visions of Jesus. So we're talking about going from arguably 500 Christians in Iran, arguably 20 years ago, to over 1 million now. So just even taking 10%, that's 100,000 potential spiritual encounters with Jesus that wouldn't be evidenced, wouldn't be able to, would be internal. So I think it would be somewhat critical or arrogant of me or anyone else to say that can't happen. And I mean, there are lots of these stories out there. So I think that it's absolutely a way of having knowledge. And then, of course, through evidence, we can, as we were discussing earlier, whether it be about the resurrection or the existence of God, I think there are both ways to access information and knowledge of God.
Steve, I'd love to get your input on this as well. Can personal, spiritual, or existential experiences be considered as valid evidence? And if not, what role should they play in shaping a person's belief system?
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly. And I just kind of want to touch on what Mike said there. I want to shy away from the ad populum fallacy because just and it could be true. Like, I mean, the amount of people that believe something and it in being based on a certain thing doesn't mean that the idea or the belief is false. It's just not really a way to state that evidence is provided for that thing. I mean, like the majority of Canadians and Americans seems to be shifting towards non-belief, which doesn't mean that that's true either, right? So I just kind of want to shy away from the idea of the way the population swings or the way that people swing. And is that kind of what the question is around?
Yeah, basically it's asking this idea, like, for example, we can argue opinions on kind of what we believe is accurate from biblical textuary understanding or from scientific investigation and kind of the philosophies or beliefs that come from that. But I'm talking about someone who says, and Mike, you were alluding to it when you were speaking about people in Iran having literal visions of Jesus, and as a result of that, coming to faith in Jesus. That's kind of where it's coming from. Is, do you think that a person's personal experience, what they say was their personal experience with spiritual, whether that was Hindu, Allah, Baha'i, Christianity, what have you, can those be considered as valued?
Okay.
Or as valid, not
as
valued,
valid. Oh,
obviously
okay.
Valued, but valid.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I think I got what you're saying now.
Cool.
Yeah, I think so. I think that when someone comes to a belief, whether they came to it through evidence or from just faith, I do feel like that they're valid in believing it, because I do feel like it provides comfort and meaning to people. There's been times where I've had certain beliefs about something, and someone will kind of burst my bubble, and I'll go, ah, shoot, because I really, really wanted to believe that, and it gave me some meaning for that to believe that. Like this whole situation with Ukraine and Russia. And people keep saying, oh, Ukraine's on the winning, they're winning now, and I'm like, oh, that's amazing, and then someone will provide evidence that no, you know what, Russia's really crushing them, and I'm like, ah, I really don't want to believe that. It's giving me meaning and hope that Ukraine is winning, right? So I understand that it can give people those valid feelings and meaning in their life, even if it's not a true belief. And even if it could be a true belief, or it might not be a true belief, but if it's providing meaning and it's coming from an internal source, as long as you're not harming other people or whatever, then I feel like it is a valid thing to feel and to do.
Mike, do you want to respond to that in any way?
I guess it's the question of, at the end of the day, we want true beliefs. So, I think it's very valid to ask someone, maybe not the day they see the vision, but at a later time, okay, why do you believe? And I think that's something, and guilty as charged Christians are sometimes guilty of, is that we will put forward, our beliefs in Christ, but we won't fall back on, 1 Peter 3:15 in terms of having a reason for why we believe.
With gentleness and kindness.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And hopefully, and if I'm not doing that today.
Oh, you are. I really appreciate the way you're approaching this today.
But I think that's why I think, again, they work together. I think there's validity, like Steve mentioned, in having a belief. But if you're going to go out in the world and profess that belief, then I think, it goes upon all of us to take that an extra further step and to validate.
Yeah. Speaking about just the respect that you guys obviously have for each other in this conversation, I thank you for that, obviously. And it's great to be able to have a place where we can discuss some of these deeper ideas,
Absolutely.
deeper thoughts without the echo chambers or without somebody, just feeling like if they don't absolutely convince everybody of their side that somehow they've lost or something like that. That's not what irrational is about. We're literally about joining the dialogue, not the divide. And so I really appreciate the contributions that you guys are both making to this. I want to move in towards morality, because I think this is a question that I sometimes think it's unfairly thrown at secular humanists, in that you can't possibly have a moral system if you don't have a God. So let's spend a little bit of time here. Steve, how does a secular worldview ground concepts like morality, value, purpose, without appealing to a divine or something bigger than yourself? Go ahead.
Yeah, and I know that Mike is going to know this as well, because I'm sure that before he became a Christian, he also felt that he was a moral person, or that he knew what. I know you said that before, but or at least you knew, kind of what the social contract is between humans. So basically, there's evidence of this, and I don't want to say again this is 100% a proven fact. We don't know for sure, but there's a lot of evidence that changes in allele frequency in species have enabled us to find what works to survive, right? So if you are working with a group of people and you are able to overcome, an external threat, you're going to be able to live long enough to pass on your genes to the next generation. That generation is hopefully going to have those genes that are helping them to survive, to be able to pass those on to somebody else, to something in the future. And throughout history of humanity and other creatures as well, other animals, there is a lot of evidence that these types of things are built upon for the well-being of the species to continue and thrive.
So, Mike, what does Christianity offer in this whole area of morality that you feel secular humanism cannot?
That's a great question. And another one we can take some time to discuss, and we could do I know they do entire university courses on it. And I think the difference in Christianity is that we would have what we would call an objective moral, view of objective moral standards, and that there are, from God, there are moral standards that are imbued on us that we are, we should be desirous to follow, but as well that we are expected to follow. And so I think Steve on a podcast with Lamar
Durante.
at 55046, you kind of mentioned that you have a belief in subjective morality. Would that still be your perspective?
Yeah, I think, and again, I really want to put the disclaimer out there that I don't want to insult anyone or make you feel.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
but I think at the same time, we really want to have a discussion
we
about,
do,
okay,
we
yeah,
do, we definitely do.
about what these
Definitely.
things
Yeah.
are.
I feel that whether or not there is a God, I think it still would be a subjective morality because it would be subject to the mind of God, unless you think that the idea of morality transcends God by any means.
Well, that's, kind of portion of the Euthyphro dilemma,
Right.
that
Yep.
you're stating.
Right.
Whereas, I think the Christian response, as it's been for hundreds of years, we would typically say that, the morality is a part of God's nature. It's about who He is. So it isn't a case of transcending or being underneath. It's a part of who He is. So, and that's where objective morality would come from. So,
Yeah,
so that would
I
be
can
my take on
understand.
that.
I can understand where you're coming from on that. I think that if we talk about like the changing nature of God and whether or not God changes His nature or changes the outcomes to things or what He wants to see, I think that's kind of where we would maybe see it, maybe more of subjective take on things.
In what way? Could you flesh it out a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And again, we don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole because we don't want it to turn into any type of like debate. I was hoping to more focus on like,
Yeah,
our common ground, but just, things like, I don't even really want to mention it, but the whole slavery thing, right? So just like,
again,
we have
go ahead, mention all those things.
for sure,
I mean,
for sure.
they're
Yeah,
a part of what I have to own as a Christian.
for sure.
And actually in preparation, I haven't, previous to my studies, I never really looked at that subject. And so in preparation for this, I certainly did. And it is not an easy question. However, I would push back on the idea of God changing over time. I think that we see ample reasons to believe that God is changing changing the circumstances at which He leads a population, but His overarching nature remains the same throughout Scripture and throughout time.
Sure. And I know there's some people that believe that, and there's some people that believe the latter. So I just, for me, from the outside looking in, it seems like a subjective thing to me. I could be wrong. There could be an objectivity to it. I mean, even there could be an objective morality that transcends a God as well, right? I don't know. There's people that claim to know. There's other people that, there's a guy by the name of T-Jump, and he's on the internet, on YouTube and everything. And basically he'll have conversations where he says that there is an objective morality outside of God or any gods. So I just, for
Yeah,
me,
well, I would love to go down that rabbit hole. I mean, this
sure.
idea of it's often called brute facts. That morality is in brute facts, and and I have to wonder about it because I don't know about this individual, but would he be a naturalist? Would he be a materialist?
He is, yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think we could make the argument that, evolution didn't know that we were coming. We
No,
as
that's true.
humans were an accident. So if we could imagine, it's often said if we could rewind the biological clock, we would be different. So say in an alternate evolution, we've got flavonoids and block bloppers. And, and there would be moral rules about flavonoids and block blockers. And maybe you can't touch the feet of a block blocker, and that's a moral no-no. But they could conceivably exist, but so could in almost an infinite number of other
Right.
potential organisms.
Which
So
is why to me it does seem subjective, because then it would be based on the society. It'd be the societal contract that they have for each other.
okay, well, yeah. So now we're talking, because generally brute facts, people will say that they're almost acted in an objective way. But if it's about morality and about evolution, uh, yeah, I would suspect that I would offer that there are challenges there in terms of how that's applied, even today in our societies.
For sure. So yeah, we can move on to another one there, Kurt, if you want.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So is faith irrational or rational in a different way? And let's unpack it this way. Steve, as a secular humanist married to a Christian, How do you navigate the fundamental worldview differences in your day-to-day life? What has that experience changed or challenged or clarified for you in living inside of that reality? Because I think this is an interesting thing. This isn't something I come across very often, that like someone who's actively, you're not just a secular humanist. You're an efficient, you're like heading the charge here in Canada kind of thing. You're on that level. And so you've got children with a wife who believes, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but what must be in some ways 180 degrees away from what you believe. How do you navigate all of that? And
Yeah.
Go ahead.
That's the $1,000,000 question, and I get this asked I get asked this a lot. And the crazy thing is, it's a long story, and I don't think we have time to get into it today. But basically, when we had met, I was going through what I considered to be a conversion to Christianity, which never really materialized. So I had joined the Masonic Lodge, and at the time, they said you have to believe in a higher power. And I said, I guess when I walk under power lines, it's higher than me. I guess it's a higher power, right? So when I joined, I didn't realize how inherently Christian the organization is. And when I started listening to the stories, because all the stories are very biblical, and I'm like, this is cool. Like I really like learning about this, and this seems to be, Christians are great people. It seems to be a really good group to belong to. And so I met my wife at the same time, and I thought like, oh, well, she's Christian, and I'm now joining this Christian organization. Maybe there's something to Christianity, right? So I was doing a lot of investigation, a lot of soul searching, and thinking about, what it is that I'm trying to accomplish here. I even went to the United Church that she was attending and said, I want to be affirmed in the faith. And when I talked to the minister, he was like, well, you just can't say that you just believe it. Like, you actually have to believe it. And I'm like, okay, well, then I might have a little bit of a problem here, because, I just can't seem to get over that hump. And, just from the outside looking in, it's really hard. And I know that, Mike, you've also felt this. It's a hard thing to try and look at that and say there's some truth to it, but what is true and what isn't, right? And I never got past that hump. So at one point at our wedding, at our reception, her parents got up and did a speech. And I love her parents. Her father passed away a couple of years ago, and it's devastated our entire family. We still have not gotten over it. I don't think we ever will. Amazing person, very faithful man. He got up and said, "We're so happy she met a man who believes the exact same thing she does." And that hit me hard, because I'm like, you know what? I really wish I could for you guys. I really wish I could. I really wish I could fit into this neat little bubble that you have created. I was going to church with the family. They had no reason to think I wasn't a believer. And I actually, felt like a wolf in sheep's clothing at that point. I'm like, wow, I really feel like I'm the only one here who doesn't believe this. And I don't want to be passing the plate around and lighting the Christ candle when it really has no meaning to me and it's fooling other people. So I decided to be honest about my lack of belief. And it really started a chain reaction of negativity, because my wife even said, if she had known I was a non-believer when we first got together, she wouldn't have given me a second chance, and things like that, right? So I did a lot of searching, and I found Anthony Magnabosco, who does street epistemology online. I found his videos, and he used to be the type of person who would go to a preacher on the street and say, F you, whatever, because the guy is saying you're going to burn in hell. And instead, he picked up a book and learned how to do street epistemology, which is asking Socratic questions to get at the heart of why somebody believes what they believe. Well, a lot of people use that in a way to try and deconvert people, but I actually decided to use it in a way that's to understand where people are coming from. And if I can understand where people are coming from, then I can develop that mutual acceptance. If they can accept me for who I am, I'm going to accept them for who they are. And then at that point, you can actually build on that to get to the point of mutual respect. So at the same time I was going through this and learning these tools on how to build this rapport with people and have these cordial conversations, I also discovered Dale McGowan, who is an author who wrote a book called In Faith and in Doubt about interfaith relationships. And a couple of the tips that he put in there were you could create a word cloud of words that mean something to you and your spouse and your family. You just type in words into this generator, and it makes this giant word cloud. So there's so many words up there of things that we had in common, like love, like kindness, like happiness, like family, like children, right? All these words. And another tip that he gave was make a list of things that are positives and negatives to having an interfaith relationship. And one thing that I didn't know ahead of time is my wife said, well, one of the negatives is that I wish I could be more of a Christian than I am. Like, I wish I could be more of a Christian. And I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know that I was preventing you from being a Christian. So how can I provide that for you? And, she just said, well, I really want to be able to go to church once in a while. I really want to be able to take the kids to church once in a while. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. If that's going to make you feel closer to God, closer to your community, closer to your beliefs, absolutely do that. Absolutely. And I never want to hold back my children from learning something that may be true. Right. So, and like Mike said, we're all looking for truth. We're all looking for things that are true, that actually comport to reality. So if there's something that they can discover, or my wife can discover, or I can discover eventually that is different than what I believe today, then I'm going to be following that path to where it leads. And that is to say that at this point in my life, I have done a lot of analysis. I've done a lot of digging to find truth. And at this point, this is the conclusion I've come to, but it's an open-ended conclusion. There's no set in stone. This is where I'm at. But I have built the foundation that I'm standing on brick by brick. So it's a really solid foundation. Like Mike has said in his previous talks, one that I saw, is that, he's the type of person that people would say, oh, this person's never going to convert to Christianity. This person is a very solid atheist. It's never going to happen. That could happen to me. I don't see it happening, but I'm not ruling it out as a possibility. And that's, the same thing for my family. If they end up choosing, and I don't think you can choose your beliefs. I think you're either convinced or you're not. But if they end up being convinced that Christianity or Islam is true, I'm going to love them no matter what. It's not going to prevent me from having a relationship with my family or my friends. And I have a lot of friends and family outside of my own worldview. And, I think just having that mutual respect for people is kind of the building blocks to a relationship. So whether it's about differences in politics, differences in religion, differences in anything, I think that's the main key takeaway is the mutual respect.
Mike, what do you think Christians can learn from people who live ethically, meaningfully? Like Steve, very obviously, is a compassionate and passionate man. I love this. And
absolutely.
What do you think Christians can learn from people who live an ethical and meaningful life outside of faith?
Well, to start off, I love hearing Steve's heart about, and his integrity, towards his wife and his family. It's, it is inspiring. And I think, that's a model to hold up. I'm sure there are other parts in your life, like all of ours, that we don't hold up.
Don't look in the closet over there.
That's right. But I do want to hold up that portion and I reflect on my time, when I was an atheist, I could not have said those things about myself. I was much more of the angry atheist, and it wasn't an encouragement. I didn't encourage my wife in a lot of ways. I was probably much more of a discourager because, I'm sure that anyone watching this could tell, Steve and I aren't the same. We're made differently because I didn't believe it was true. And therefore that to me had implications beyond it. But then by virtue of becoming a believer, my version, so I would differ with Steve in terms of how we get convinced of things, especially within a Christian context. But nevertheless, I think all Christians can learn from virtuous, naturalists, materialists, atheists, because, when we look in scripture itself, Paul tells us that we're all rotten to the core, in terms of, and I know Steve's probably going on, but that is what basically Paul says. We're all sinners. We've all rebelled against God. So when Christians look down their noses at any other worldview, I think that's a problematic place to be in because we're not looking in the mirror. And I think as a Christian, every morning, that's the first thing we should be looking at is ourselves, going, okay, what have I done wrong? What can I do better? Who can I help today? And I am the first one to say I don't always do that, but nevertheless, I think that's what we should espouse to. So we should be very, very reticent to, criticize non-Christians because their moral standards are different. And I think that's where a dialogue has to happen and not a hammer.
My dad used to say that anytime you point one finger out at somebody, there's three
Absolutely.
pointing straight back at you, right? Sorry, Steve, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. No, I've heard that saying before. I love that saying. But no, I really appreciate you saying that, Mike. And I really wish I could go and find you as an angry atheist and help you and not help you stay away from religion. I feel like Christianity has helped you. I feel like that's a really good thing. And I would have encouraged you to become a Christian as well if that's something that was meaningful to you. But I really wish I could have helped just kind of be there for you and even just been a shoulder to cry on at that time.
Steve, it's interesting, the angry atheist idea. And then, I can throw that over and say the angry Christian too. And I've often said, if we could keep the wackos of both of our faith systems off the TV screen, people would like us both more, you know?
You know what? There's a really funny saying that I just saw around Christmas time, and it said, instead of putting Christ in Christmas, put Christ back in Christian. And I thought that was kind of a clever thing. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't, again, I don't want to be insulting. I just think that was a really clever thing that came up.
No,
someone came
don't
up
worry.
with.
You can't be insulting here. Like, I don't think anybody's going to enjoy any of the episodes of irRational if they don't understand that some of their beliefs are going to get challenged, but done in a way that is respectful and friendly. And so this episode, certainly when we're talking about faith, it's such a personal thing that I don't think we can help but challenge and maybe offend, but hopefully in a way that is open-handedly offensive. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
that allows
Right.
space for a person to discover. And I think you guys are both doing this.
And I think you're right. I've actually had feedback from my book where people have said, well, it's actually made me a stronger believer. And I'm like, well, that's amazing. If you found something to resonate with in the book that's made you dig deeper into your own faith and come out a better person for it, that's awesome. I love that. I love hearing that.
I think anytime our beliefs are challenged, it's healthy. And I know for myself, like, how can I know that I actually believe what I believe if I've never faced critique, if I've never faced a doubt, if I've never faced a challenge? Like, that's how you know that what you believe is actually what you believe, is when it stands up against the headwinds, right?
Right.
And I think that's a true situation. Mike, when we look at then this, Steve, this is coming to you too. Don't think you're getting out of this one. But looking at your own lives, how have your beliefs or lack thereof shaped the way you approach relationships, moral decisions, suffering, and hope? And maybe focus a little bit on suffering, because when I think about one of the probably greatest arguments against Christianity, I think it's around this idea of suffering. So, Mike, let me throw that out at you first, that whole idea of how have your beliefs, the lack thereof, shaped the way you approach relationships, moral decisions, suffering, and hope?
Yeah, well, at 60 years old, you anyone my age, not that I'm that old, but we have definitely had, I've definitely had, things in my life happen. In my case, my mother died way earlier than she should have. I had a brother that died in his mid-20s after an extremely difficult growing up. It's just, it happens. And it's, this question of evil and suffering is really one that we all have to answer, whether or not you have a naturalistic worldview or a Christian worldview or whatever the case may be. It's one that you have to answer. And before I say my next couple things here, I just want to maybe add something to those listeners who are, now in the midst of suffering. Please turn off this podcast and come back later, because this, I think, is an important subject to kind of to grapple down on a little bit. So, and I'd like to start with, okay, so a lot of times we have to ask, what would we expect if there is a God? What would be, or the God of Christianity in my case, or what would I expect if atheism were true? So, I'd like to start off with a quote with Richard Dawkins of his book, River Out of Eden. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, the universe has precisely the properties we would expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So I think, that's it's a reductionist kind of perspective, but I think there's nothing logically wrong with that quote. So, so then, but then in terms of Christianity, I look at brokenness, because essentially what we're kind of talking about a lot of times is just what we all know about the world being broken. There are things that shouldn't, we often use that moral language, it should not be like this. My sister should not have had to endure that. My brother should not have died, so early, so young. So we're always using that kind of language. And in Christianity, it's expected in terms of Jesus tells us this life will be hard. So there's nothing in Christianity that sugarcoats this whole thing, but in Christianity, what we have is we have a God who redeems it. We have a God who steps into history, takes, on flesh. Sometimes I reflect on what it would have been like to live in First Temple Judaism. I mean, they didn't have flush toilets, they didn't have like all those kind of things that we take so much for granted. I mean, it would have been a tough time to be alive. And to think that the God, the creator, came down to earth at that time frame, I think is kind of, to me, says a lot right there. But that he was, scourged, crucified, beaten, and eventually crucified by his own creation. I mean, so, on Christianity, yes, we will deal with evil things, but we have a God who understands profoundly our hurts, our pain, and can walk along and offers hope. I think that, I'm anxious to hear when Steve responds, but I think one thing, not that hope is a reason to believe, but it's a pretty nice, side benefit. And it kind of reminds me, and I'd just like to share before I hand it over to Steve, and share a story that sometimes, we say, well, there's so much suffering, and, how, why? And I was in Sudbury doing a small apologetics conference with Wes Huff and Mike Thiessen. This was before Wes became the Wes. But and Wes had just finished talking about the problem of evil. And this lady came up. I can still, picture today. She came up to the microphone and she was sobbing, and she was kind of semi-mad, and she was like, she had professing to be a Christian, but she had, just had a child who had, I believe it was cancer, and basically died in her arms at about 6 months old. I mean, if you could, I mean, that's just, as a parent, it disheartened all of us. And but what was interesting was, as she continued talking, and she was saying, why? And then she's talking about how her life had changed and what she was doing now. She was working and counseling people, young mothers who were in dire situations. And, it was like the light came on for herself. It's like, oh, wow. Like, okay, I see how God is working. And we rarely get that opportunity. I'm not saying we do. And our knowledge of all those things but when we do get to see a light, it's pretty incredible to think about what God can do.
Yeah. The whole area of pain, I mean, it's something that I think truly connects every single human being, is that
Absolutely.
we will go through stuff in this life that you shake your head. I've often said it like this, if I knew all the waters my boat would sail through, my lifeboat would sail through when it left the harbor, I might have been awful tempted to stay and just enjoy where I was. But that's just not the way life is. Steve, I warned you, I'm coming at you here with this one. The same thing that I've asked Mike, and I want you to share from your heart and your perspective of where you come from in your beliefs. How have you been shaped in the way that you approach moral decisions, the way you approach suffering, and of course, this area of hope once again?
Yeah. Well, wow, Mike, that was really powerful. Thank you so much for sharing all that, especially about the little baby. It kills me as a parent to hear that. The one thing that I can do, and the problem with the secular humanist perspective, is that we can't offer hope for an afterlife. But what we can do is we can offer hope for this life. And basically, as a volunteer at Recovering from Religion, I've dealt with a lot of people who call in and they have existential dread. Now that I don't believe, what is there to worry about or to care about? And how do I keep going? And it's funny because I actually quote them another Richard Dawkins line, and it's, "We are the lucky ones." And it's a really long passage, but I usually read it to them over the phone if I'm talking to them on the phone. But it's basically talking about how given the amount of combinations of DNA that could be possible, it's us here that are living. We are the lucky ones that get to live. It sucks that we have to die, but at least we got to live. And I think that that's one thing that we can provide to other people, is to say, you know what, there is a lot of suffering. There is a finality to life as far as we know. There's no guarantee of another life, so let's live the best life that we can live here and now, and all we have is each other.
What do you think people on the other side of your views most often misunderstand about your worldview? Steve, let's start with you on this one. What do you think people most misunderstand?
The funny thing is here is that because I tread such a middle line, I kind of get flack from both sides. I get flack from people who are religious, and then I also get flack from people who are non-religious because they think I'm being too generous or too open and kind to people who believe things that they don't believe. But basically, I think that what people seem to not understand about, first of all, atheism is just a lack of belief in a deity. It doesn't have a worldview attached to it. There's nothing other than that. It's just that simple statement. When you get into what it is that you actually believe, that's when you need a philosophy like humanism, secular humanism, where you can rely on the compassion, empathy, kindness, scientific investigation that comes along with that. You need something else to define who you are, and I find a lot of times people are defined by what they aren't, and that is a little bit of a problem, especially when I go into something like an interfaith symposium when they're like, "This is the atheist speaker," and I have to get up and every single time give a definition of what atheism is, and then say, "But I'm also a secular humanist, and this is what I do believe."
Mike, how about you? What do you think people most misunderstand about your worldview?
I would I would suspect it is the interfaith between science and Christianity, or science and belief in God. I mean, that's a part of it that's close to my heart. When I look at, consider what the status was and where we were, say, at the turn of the 19th century in terms of Darwin had just come out with this theory, and generally science believed in a steady state universe, and there was no evidence of fine tuning, and there had been not as much thought on some philosophical questions. I mean, that to me was a bit of a nadir. But when I look at the status and how science and faith, if anything, the more I read, and probably that's the majority of my apologetics reading is science-based, is the more I see how faith and Christianity, belief in God, work together. I mean, looking at history and Galileo and Newton and see how it worked. I mean, their faith is what gave them the framework to really discover within, to work within, to be rational about. And then I look at that progress today, and whether it be where we are in our studies about the origin of life, even challenges to the neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, or where we are, especially in the fine-tuning argument. I just see they work so well together. But I think there's in our society there is still this, and I think it came maybe from the Dawkinses of the world during that phase of new atheism that kind of crept into society, that there's a battle between science and faith, and I don't believe that's the case.
So what would you say, Steve, is the strongest argument against your own position, and how did you get yourself past that to believe what you still believe today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that even just touching on what we last captured there is, the belief in an afterlife, like that something else is waiting for us after this, I think is a really appealing idea. And I really hope it's true. I mean, it would be really cool to continue living beyond this life. I don't see how it's possible. But again, I don't know, right? So, I mean, it would be really cool if that was the case. And I think that that is a really strong reason for people to hold on to their faith, is for that hope that Mike was mentioning, hope that there's something after this, hope that someone is there to take care of us and to look after us. And I think that's a really strong thing that a lot of people have. And for those of us who don't have that, we have to do that for each other here. We have to be our own guardian angels. We have to be a guardian angel for somebody else, and they have to be a guardian angel for us. And so that's where I've volunteered for organizations where I can do that. I can reach out and be a shoulder to cry on for somebody, and to be there for somebody here and now, because we're not promised anything in the future.
Mike, how about you? What's the strongest argument against Christianity, and how were you able to get over that, or how would you help somebody get over it?
I guess one of the strongest challenge, and I would have said, challenge until I was able to get into it a little bit more, would probably be a lot of these questions about the character of God, these questions about the Old Testament God. As I used to kind of put them in a corner and not worry about them, but actually in preparation for this podcast, I certainly dug into them a lot more. And there's some challenging questions there. There's no two ways about it. You know, Steve said in one of his interviews, you know, we often contextualize things away, but I honestly do believe that is what is important in those situations, is to kind of say, okay, what was happening around us and what direction did God give for the Israelites? And especially because we look at all the ways the Israelites did not follow what was written. I mean, you know, the entire Old Testament is about God trying to woo the Israelites and trying to keep them on course. The story is just the Israelites. They get these miracles, and then, you know, 2 days later they're building a golden calf. I mean, it's just, you know, it's just story after story after story. So, you know, I look and it's like, why didn't he say this or why didn't he say that? And then I realized, well, they didn't even follow what was written. So if there had been more written, they would have. And I came to realize as well is that, like, especially we talked about slavery a little bit. I think one of the things that we, you know, it kind of came to me was we have to look at the trajectory in some of the places outside of Israel. So if we look at slavery, for example, of what happened in Egypt, and we saw, you know, initially slavery was just indentured servitude and of short duration, and then over time it grew and grew and grew. Now we look at same thing, you know, so that was to the southwest, and then to the northeast we have Babylon. So we have initially the Code of Hammurabi, which kind of had some, you know, some semblance of protection, but then we look at what actually happened in the Babylonian context and see what happened to slavery in reality. So I think that, you know, so just understanding that kind of gave me a lot of peace about those kind of issues. But I think those are always going to be a challenging issue for us as Christians.
Yeah, definitely. Mike, I'll start with you on this one. If your worldview were to be proven false tomorrow morning, what would you lose and what would you gain in your life?
What would I lose? See, I'm probably a little different than Steve in this way. I would be very reductionist in terms of how I would see life without God. I mean, in terms of determinism, in terms of lack of free will, the ability to choose otherwise, when I use those words, and all the implications of that, because really who we are is really the product of a gazillion little decisions, big and small. Whereas if I was to reflect on determinism and realize that, you know, I'm just reading anyway, to take materialism to its natural conclusion, I think I would lose a lot of that self. And, you know, this idea of purpose, you know, I'll say, quote Richard Dawkins here, life has no higher purpose than to perpetuate the survival of our DNA. I think that's a very reductionist perspective on it. And I think in a different light is the quote that Steve gave for sure. But see, I would be the reductionist type. That would be the way I'm wired. And so to me, it would be significant, you know, and what I would gain, I would certainly gain more money. I would gain more time because I wouldn't be doing things that I'm doing now, but I can't, you know, when I think of the things I would lose, it's not a reason to believe, because I don't think that's why I believe.
No, yeah.
But I think it would be.
Steve, how about you? If all of a sudden your worldview was flat out proven wrong tomorrow morning when you woke up, what would you gain? What would you lose from what your life is today?
Well, I want to kind of ask you on that. Does this mean that Christianity is true, or does that mean like a vast array of anything else that ever is possible could be possibly true?
I mean, we could certainly address it from the light of Christianity.
Christianity? Okay.
But
so if I woke up tomorrow and Christianity was proven true, is that the way you
Sure.
want to take it? Sure.
Really, however you take it, I'd rather have you kind of...
No, for sure. And I think it's better to be more specific than to be general like that, because I think that there's so many different options of what could be possible if my worldview is incorrect, because we could be all in the matrix or something, right? So, you know, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, because I've done some research on
Blue
that.
Pill, red pill.
There's about 2% chance that we're not in the matrix. So
there.
No, so
if Boltzmann brains, yeah, absolutely.
If Christianity was proven true and I woke up tomorrow and that was a fact, I wouldn't lose much. I wouldn't lose much, because I still feel like I'm living the life that most Christians want to live. I think that there's a lot of people who would look at my life and go, wow, you know, he's living the way that most people say that they should or want to aim to live like. So, and I take pride in that. I really want to be a a good person and an open person and help people. And what would I gain? I would actually, what I would talk about, gain an afterlife. I would, if I found out for sure that this is the truth, then I would do everything I can to ensure that myself and my family do whatever we can to be able to live beyond this life.
Yeah. Guys, thank you so much. A lot of questions answered, a lot of questions left unanswered. We might need a 2.0.
Well, actually, I just want to say one more thing for Mike. Just for Mike, if you ever get into that situation, and I know that you probably won't, but please look for me. And there's also a girl by the name of Brittany Hartley. She has a podcast called No Nonsense Spirituality, where she has covered a lot of this. She went through a period of existential dread, and now she's helping people, find spirituality even beyond their beliefs that have fallen apart. So,
well, I'm not anticipating.
No, I'm not either.
Showing me an empty tomb in the near future.
Yeah, I know for sure.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
I just want you to know that the offer is there. If anything ever happens, or even if any kind of crisis happens, I'm here for you.
Well, and likewise, if you have questions about Christianity or
absolutely
anyway, we have our contact information. I'd love to. I'd even fly up there and buy you a beer.
Hey, there you go.
There we go. That's awesome.
Bring me.
Okay.
Absolutely. I look forward to this conversation happening again, perhaps on the stage of the first irRational conference, which hopefully is going to hit sometime in 2027. But anyway, it should be a good time for sure. Anyway, guys, again, thank you so much. I like to give an opportunity for my guests to be able to kind of share what's going on in their life right now. Also, if you're willing to let people know how they can get in touch with you if they have questions about either position that you guys both have today, then I like to do that. So, Steve, what have you got going on in your life, and how can people reach out to you?
Well, that's a loaded question there, Kurt. I've got a lot going on. I mean, I got 2 young kids that are a handful, but I do. Eventually, I'm trying to write a sequel to the book that I have. It's going to be called Humanism at Hand: Practical Principles for Peaceful Partnerships. And, it's going to draw on conversations like this, where I've actually had actual conversations with people to see, how can we find that common ground between us and what shared values do we have? So that's going to be something in the coming up. There's always something. If you Google my name, there's always something going on with me. I'm trying to stay as busy as possible. You can find me on Facebook. You can follow me on there, and that usually has my contact information if anyone wants to message me. I get a lot of questions. I get a lot of people reaching out and either telling me that I'm evil and that I'm going to burn forever, or I'll get people saying, that I've helped them some way, and either are fine.
Yep. Right on. Thank you so much. Mike, how about you? What have you got going on in your life? And
I kind of wish I was as busy as Steve, but I'm just busy with different stuff. I'm doing a little talk next month in Kingswood University. I think hopefully I got that name right. It's just with Cody in New Brunswick. So I'm looking forward to that. Apart from that, if people have questions, I would just steer them to the Apologetics Canada website. I mean, lots of great resources, and there's just it's a great place to start. I'd love people to check out our podcast in terms of. I think we are really an organization that tries to defend what we believe, but with gentleness and respect. So, you'll hear our podcast, hopefully much like, the tone of today, in terms of, we're looking for truth, and we're not seeing an adversary on the other side of the screen or the table. We're seeing people that if they were neighbors, we'd be friends.
Absolutely.
So it's that, it's with that spirit that, we talk about things, and as well in terms of resources for the truth of Christianity, that would be Apologetics Canada would be a great place to go.
Perfect.
I always appreciate Christians when they approach it from the 1 Peter 3:15 perspective.
Yeah. Well, it's how it should be done, right? Like that's it. And likewise, like both. I mean, I don't think secular humanists have a Bible verse to pull from to say the same thing, but I really appreciate it. Thank you guys for the excellent dialogue, for the level of respect. And I would like to do this again sometime with both of you, and look forward to following both of you and kind of where life takes you from here. So that's our episode of irRational. And remember that new episodes drop on the 15th of every month, because we like to keep things right in the middle. Next month, our episode is actually entitled Canada, Royalty or Republic? Should Canada stay with the monarchy? Or should we let that go? And is it time for us to have our own head of state elected by our own people? We discuss, you decide. This episode of irRational is being brought to you by New Being Nation. Subscribe to their monthly box or shop their online store for a delicious variety of coffee that you can have delivered to your door just through 2 to 3 days off of roast for most of Canada. Check out Canada's freshest home-delivered coffee at www.newbeingnation.ca and use code irRational when you check out to receive 15% off your first subscription box or your in-store order. Thank you for joining irRational.